gang, we are in week 5 and the final week of our Big Picture series where we've been taking a look at the wild, crazy life of Joseph. As we've watched Joseph go from the favorite son of his dad, all the way to second in command in Egypt, we've been watching how God has been working behind the small details of Joseph's life to make a bigger picture. And so today, the question I want to begin with is, have you ever been so mad at somebody that all you wanted to do was get payback? We've all had one of those experiences where somebody's done something to us, whether it's huge or small, where we, in our minds, are just like, if I could only find a way to pay them back for what they did. Whatever that's looked like, we've all experienced some kind of wrong, and we all have that capacity for payback. We all have that internal desire to see wrongs righted, for us to pay somebody back. And that can kind of come out in a couple of different ways. It can come out in a really public fashion. Maybe you've confronted somebody in the hallway after an argument or started an argument in front of everybody. Maybe it's you've tagged somebody in a really nasty post on social media. Maybe you've sought out opportunities to embarrass them in front of either a girl or a guy they liked, or maybe even in front of their friends. Other ways that we go about getting payback are a little more private, and they're a little more passive. I am one of those passive people. I'm not going to confront a bunch of people, but I'm a passive person. If you're a passive person, you've probably spread a rumor, talked about somebody behind their back. Maybe you've changed seats at lunch and never really said anything about it. Maybe you just roll your eyes. And the other one, and it's the one that really only impacts you, it's that you want to get payback in your head. You've had one of those moments that you just replay over and over in your mind. And not only are you replaying that moment over and over in your mind, but you're playing out the perfect payback. Whatever that looks like, we've all had those internal imaginary arguments where you kind of play through that scene in your mind that you've not actually taken any steps for payback, but you think about it all the time. And honestly, the reason that we all have this capacity for payback is because it feels fair to us. That if we've been wronged, we want the other person to be wronged just as much as we have. It's that whole eye for an eye thing, that if somebody pokes me in the eye, I want to poke them right back. It's because we've got this internal justice system that we want to make sure everything is even and fair. And we've got in this story of Joseph, this huge moment where Joseph is going to get the opportunity to get that payback. And if you've been paying attention the past 4 weeks, Joseph has a ton of reason to be looking for some payback. We started this series talking about how his brothers were super mad at him because he was a little arrogant about being his dad's favorite kid. And what ends up happening is that they throw him down in a well and they sell him into slavery. That's some pretty tough sibling rivalry. And then he gets into Egypt and he works his way up into a government official named Potiphar's house. And then Potiphar's wife makes up this whole scenario and gets him thrown in jail. And then he spends all this time in jail and he's trying to do the right thing and he's trying to help people out. And he tells the baker and the cupbearer interprets their dreams, and then the cupbearer forgets about him for 2 years. Man, if Joseph has all the reason in the world to go after some payback, there have been a ton of people in his life and in his story that in these small details of this big picture story, that Joseph's got every right for a little bit of payback. But today in our story of Joseph, we find him kind of in the best spot he's been in a long, long time. The cupbearer has remembered him. He has interpreted one of Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh has put him second in command in all of Egypt. One of the major world powers. It'd be like if Joseph was just elevated from prison to the vice president of the United States. It's that big of a jump, and he's got that much authority and power. And the reason he's been put in such a high spot is that the dream that he interpreted for Pharaoh told Pharaoh that Egypt's in for a good couple of years, and then the whole area, the whole region around Egypt is in for a massive famine. And so what Joseph and Pharaoh come up with, and with God's help, is that they're going to work super hard for the next couple of years and store up all this food so that when the famine hits, Egypt's going to be prepared. And so what Pharaoh does is he says, Joseph, you're second in command, and this is your project. I want you to take care of all the food. I want you to be in charge of who gets food, how we store food. All of that is in your power. And so those 7 good years come, and they store up in all these storehouses all this food, and then the famine hits. And not only Egypt is impacted, but the area around Egypt. And so people begin coming from miles and miles around so that Egypt can provide something from their storehouses. And wouldn't you know it, that a couple of guys walk in that Joseph recognizes immediately. His brothers show up because they're impacted with the famine as well. So they show up looking for some kind of help, and Joseph recognizes them immediately, but they don't recognize Joseph. After all, they thought their brother was long gone or dead. They had no idea that the person that they had come to ask for food was the brother that they had beaten, stripped, and sold into slavery. Man, if Joseph has every reason for payback, now he's got every opportunity for payback. His brothers are in dire need, and he holds their fate in his hands. He could have had them thrown in jail. He could have told them no. He could have done anything. After all, he's second in command in Egypt. But that's not what we see Joseph do. In fact, this is what happens. Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told him who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it carried quickly to Pharaoh's palace. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. "Please come closer," he said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. You can live in the region of Goshen, where you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and everything you own. I will take care of you there, for there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise, you, your household, and all your animals will starve." Joseph chose a different path than payback. He had every opportunity, he had every reason, but instead he chose the path of forgiveness. That is a wild, wild story from the Old Testament. One of those things that we really get to kind of see how God works, really, and how we as God's people are supposed to work. That when we've got those opportunities, those means, and those opportunities for payback, God people are supposed to go the other way. We're supposed to go down the path of forgiveness. Because in Joseph's story, we see that when you can't see the bigger picture, choose to forgive. In our stories, there are always going to be those big picture details that either we don't see or we don't understand. Those moments in life where we are like, God, why am I having to go through this? Why is this person treating me this way? Why am I having to go through such a difficult time? And in those moments, we don't see the big picture. We can see the small details, but we can't see or really understand in those moments what's going on. So in our stories of those big picture moments where we don't have the details or we don't understand them, we always have a choice. We have a choice for payback, or we have a choice for forgiveness. Joseph could have lived out his wildest fantasies of payback. He could have done it publicly, he could have done it passively, but his forgiveness changes the course of history. It changes the course for his family, and because of that one simple act to forgive, maybe not so simple because he had every right, but because Joseph, even when he didn't see the big picture, he chose to forgive, everything changes. And so for Jesus people, if that's who we're called to be, of people of forgiveness and not payback, where do we even begin to start to practice forgiveness? One thing we've got to do to begin is just to start small. I'm not asking like the most awful thing that's ever happened to you to just immediately forgive it, because those moments are difficult. What we've got to do is begin to practice in the small areas of our lives. When your little brother eats the last piece of cake, when a friend is teasing you. It's easier to forgive the big things when we practice forgiveness in the smaller things. The other thing we've got to do is, and this is always difficult, to forgive first. Question for you. Who's the last person that did something to upset you? Who's the last person that's wronged you? Here's my challenge for you. In that, don't wait for them to make the first move. You make the first move to help you move on from it. Be the first person to offer forgiveness. Don't wait for people to ask for it. Just do it. It not only does it begin to heal that relationship, but it also begins to heal a lot of stuff that's going on inside of you when you're hurt and when you feel you've been wronged. And the third thing we've got to do is to pursue forgiveness. You cannot control what the people around you do. You can't control your parents. You can't control your siblings. You can't control your friends. You can't control the people that aggravate the snot out of you. You have no control over them. The only person you have control over is you. So we, being in control of our own reactions and our own responses, we've got to choose and pursue forgiveness. Start the conversation. Unblock them on social media. Move back to that seat in lunch. Pursue forgiveness, because that is what Jesus' people are supposed to do. We've got the example of Joseph, and we've got the example of having a God who is so big, so caring, so compassionate, so forgiving, that he sent his only son here to live and to die so that we could have a right relationship with God. That's who Jesus is, and that's who Jesus' people are supposed to be. We're supposed to be people who pursue forgiveness. Now, there are going to be moments in your life, there are going to be people in your life that wound you in massive ways. There are going to be people who wound you in consistent and habitual ways. So what do we do with forgiveness in those areas? People who have hurt us to where there's really no coming back from it. People that in relationships that just constantly kind of are toxic. People who just show no remorse. People who just kind of keep on doing it over and over again. What do we do in those moments? Forgiveness is still required, even when it's difficult. Because what forgiveness does is it's not always just about the other person. It's about what's going on in our own hearts and minds. We've got to be bridge builders. That when relationships get ruined, when relationships get tense, we've got to be people who build those bridges instead of burning them down. But in those moments where there are massive injustices, where it's the habitual stuff, we can forgive without everything going back to normal. You've got to set boundaries in those areas that I forgive, but we can't go back to the way it is. And that's just sometimes how it has to be. In those places where forgiveness is hard, whether it's big, whether it's small, whatever that is, when you have issues and difficulties forgiving people, I think the best place to start is to ask for God's help, because like we said, God is the example of what forgiveness looks like. And when we struggle, when we have difficulties forgiving, going to God for help is probably a good first step. Because when we can't see the big picture, choose to forgive. We see in Joseph's story, from him rising from being the favorite son, all the way down to slavery and imprisonment, all the way back up to being Pharaoh's second in command, we see that ultimately this story has been a story about forgiveness. The big picture of this story, the bottom line of all of it, has been to forgive. We've watched how God has moved in Joseph's story. We've seen from that big picture perspective as we've gone the past 5 weeks, watching how Joseph moves and how God moves in that story. And so I've got to believe that it's true for us as well. That Joseph could only see those small little bits as he went, and we were able to see from that big picture point of view how God was working. And so the story of our lives has got to be true as well. in those small moments, in those small details where we're not quite sure what's going on, I believe that God is working something big in and around our lives. So when you can't see that big picture, choose to forgive. And as we meet over Zoom this week, the question that I want us to come prepared to think and talk about is this: what is the hardest thing about choosing to forgive? And we'll either see you on Zoom or when we get back together very soon.